The dispatch rider came at 7 in the morning, and the red seal on the letter told Celine everything she needed to know before she had even broken it open. She was already at the kitchen table, already dressed, already deep into the supply ledgers that had been bothering her for the better part of a week. The estate was quiet at this hour. The great hall was dark. The corridors held only the sound of early morning settling, the particular creak of a large house breathing around sleeping people. She went to the door before the rider could knock. The letter was from the Fenwick clan, a pack that shared a long stretch of forest border with the Blackwood territory. The message was written in the careful, controlled language of people who were very angry and doing their best not to show it yet. 3 Blackwood scouts had crossed into Fenwick hunting grounds 2 nights ago. The Fenwick Alpha wanted an immediate explanation. Celine read it twice, standing in the open doorway with the morning cold coming in around her ankles. She knew exactly what had happened. 6 days ago, the patrol rotation had been updated, and she had written a note to the patrol captain, a quiet and organized man named Bart, warning him that the new routes came dangerously close to the Fenwick border, and that the scouts would need a thorough briefing on the updated boundary markers before going out. That note had been acknowledged and apparently not acted upon. She set the letter on the table and sat down and picked up her pen. Writing diplomatic letters under pressure required something close to the kind of calm you had to build deliberately, the way you built muscle, through practice, through repetition, through choosing not to panic when panic would feel easier. She had been doing it for 4 years, and she was very good at it, though she had never been officially given the title of pack diplomat or assigned any formal authority over inter-pack correspondence. She was simply the person who did it, the way she was simply the person who did many things, without credit or complaint, because someone had to, and she was usually the most capable person in the room. The letter took her 38 minutes to write. She read it back 3 times, changed 2 words, sealed it, and walked it personally to the dispatch office on the south side of the estate, because the young clerk there sometimes confused the priority categories, and a message to the Fenwick clan at this particular moment could not afford to be sent with the wrong urgency stamp. The morning sun was just beginning to color the top of the tree line when she walked back across the estate grounds. She passed the council room and heard voices inside, Caden's among them, and kept walking. Whatever meeting had pulled him in early was not one she had been invited to. This had become normal. She noted it the way she noted the ache in her lower back after a long day, with a dull recognition and no particular expression. The Eastern Medical Wing smelled the way it always did, of pine ointment and clean linen, and the faint sweetness of the dried herbs Dorothy kept in bunches along the top shelf. Dorothy herself was already at work when Celine arrived, checking on 3 patients who had come in the previous evening with fever symptoms. Dorothy was 61 years old, and had been running the medical wing since before Caden took the Alpha title. She was one of 4 people in the entire Blackwood territory who treated Celine as a person rather than a symbol. "The boy is asking for you," Dorothy said, without looking up from the patient she was attending. Owen was 9, small for his age, and currently the most dramatically self-satisfied person in the medical wing, owing to the fact that he had survived a very high fever and was treating this as proof of his exceptional toughness. He was sitting up in bed when Celine came in, already arguing with his older brother Connor about something, and he stopped arguing the moment he saw her. "When can I leave?" he said immediately. "When Dorothy says so. I feel completely fine. You said that yesterday when you had a very high temperature." He considered this the way children considered arguments that were difficult to refute, with a brief silence followed by a change of subject. "Connor cried," he said, lowering his voice and cutting his eyes toward his brother. "I did not," Connor said, from the chair by the wall. "He did," Owen said. Celine looked at Connor, who was 17, and red-eared, with something between embarrassment and stubbornness, and she thought about her sister Mira, who had called 4 months ago, and then again 2 months ago, and both times Celine had called back several days later, with an apology and an explanation that were both technically true and entirely insufficient. She thought about Mira the way she thought about many things she did not have time to properly examine, in flashes, in the spaces between one task and the next, quickly enough that the thought dissolved before it could settle into feeling. "There is nothing wrong with caring about someone enough to be afraid for them," she told Connor. He looked at the floor. His ears went redder. She checked Owen's temperature, looked at his eyes and the color of his skin, and concluded that he was well enough to be discharged by afternoon. She told him this, and watched his face light up in a way that made her chest ache with something she could not name exactly. A kind of grief, for things that were uncomplicated, things that still had the cleanness of a simple cause and a simple effect. "When I grow up," Owen said, with the certainty of a boy who had recently survived something and emerged with new conviction, "I want to be a healer like you." Celine paused. "You could be," she said. "It is good work. Is it what you always wanted to do?" The question caught her off guard, in the way that simple, honest questions from children sometimes did. She thought about the acceptance letter from the Northwood Medical Institute that was sitting in her desk drawer, 5 years old now and soft at the folds. She thought about the day she had received it, and the day she had decided, for reasons she had called practical, not to act on it. "Yes," she said, "it is what I always wanted." She spent another hour in the medical wing. She helped Dorothy with the morning rounds, restocked the herb supply, and reviewed 3 patient records that needed updating. At some point during the second hour, she ate a piece of bread that Dorothy put in her hand without comment, and she was grateful for it because she had forgotten to eat breakfast. It was nearly noon when she finally returned to the main house. She had a water rights meeting at 1 o'clock with representatives from the eastern border community. She had 20 minutes to eat something and review her notes. The kitchen was empty. She made herself 2 slices of bread with butter and read her notes standing at the counter, and she was halfway through the first slice when she heard footsteps on the stairs above, and then Caden's voice, not calling to her but talking on the phone, already deep in some conversation that had started before he reached the bottom of the stairs. He passed the kitchen doorway. He glanced in. He did not stop. She took a breath. She finished her bread. She washed her hands and went to the meeting. The water rights discussion ran for 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than scheduled, because George, the older border representative, had a particular point about upstream usage that required reference to a document that no one had brought to the table. Celine found the relevant provision on page 7 of the third annex and read it aloud twice so everyone in the room could understand it. By the end of the meeting, they had reached an agreement that both sides found workable. She walked back to the main house in the late afternoon light, her feet sore, her back aching, her mind already moving to the supply ledger discrepancy she had not yet resolved. She sat at the desk in the study and worked through the ledger for an hour, tracking the discrepancy to a data entry error from 3 weeks ago that had compounded itself through subsequent records in a way that was simple to fix once she found it. She wrote the correction, made a note for the supply officer, and filed it. She had been doing this for 7 years, not just the ledgers, everything, the letters and the meetings and the medical rounds and the diplomatic correspondence, and the careful management of 100 small things that kept the Blackwood pack running smoothly, none of which appeared on any official record bearing her name. She had walked into this life at 21 years old, beside a man she had loved with everything she had, absolutely certain that love given so completely would be returned in kind. She had believed, with the sincere and slightly naive faith of someone who had not yet learned what people did with an open hand, that 7 years of steadiness and care and quiet sacrifice would be noticed and valued. It had not been noticed. Or rather, it had been noticed the way a clean floor was noticed, only when it became dirty. She closed the ledger and sat for a moment, with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes on the wall. Upstairs, a door opened. She heard Caden's footsteps in the corridor, and then the muffled sound of his voice, low and warm, carrying the particular quality of someone talking to a person they were genuinely pleased to speak to. She had not heard that quality in his voice when he spoke to her in a very long time. She thought about Mira's last letter, which she had not answered. She thought about the acceptance letter in her desk drawer, 5 years old and still folded into its original creases. She thought about the girl she had been at 21, standing in this house for the first time, thinking, this is the beginning of everything. It had been the beginning. She just had not understood yet that beginnings could cost things you did not know you were spending. She got up and went to make dinner. By the time Caden came to the table, it was cooling. He sat down and ate without saying much, and she sat across from him and watched the side of his face and thought, I should say something. I should say one of the things I have been carrying around for 2 years. She said, how was the council meeting this morning? He said, fine, and reached for his water. She said, George from the Eastern Territory sends his regards. The water rights agreement should hold through the winter. He looked up. Good, he said. And then, with what seemed like genuine effort, "That is good work, Celine." She smiled. "Thank you." He went back to his food. She ate in silence and told herself that tomorrow would be better. She had been telling herself that for approximately 2 years and had not yet stopped believing it, which was either a sign of extraordinary resilience or of something she was not yet ready to examine clearly. That night she lay in the dark on her side of the bed, listening to the sound of the house around her, and she thought about all the things she had given and all the things she had not been given back, and she held the feeling quietly and without anger, the way you held something very heavy that you could not yet put down because you had not found the right place for it. She was still awake at midnight. She had been lying still for 2 hours, doing everything the body was supposed to do to sleep except actually sleeping. Her mind kept pulling her back to things she had been avoiding in the daylight, things that surfaced at night when there was nothing else demanding her attention. She thought about a conversation from 3 weeks ago that she had not been able to shake. She had been passing Caden's study with a stack of correspondence to file, and she had heard voices through the partially open door, Caden's and Rowan's, and she had stopped without quite meaning to. She had not heard everything, she had not wanted to, but she had caught the words clearly enough. Caden saying that some people made everything feel simple, that there was a difference between a person who made you feel steady and a person who made you feel alive. She had not heard who he was talking about. She had told herself she did not need to know. She had walked away and filed the correspondence and spent the rest of that day being extremely efficient and extremely quiet. The moonlight came in through the curtain gap and laid a thin line of silver across the foot of the bed. She stared at it. She thought, "I am not happy." She had not been happy in a long time. She had been busy and useful and often tired and sometimes proud of herself in the way you were proud of managing something difficult. But happiness, the simple and habitable kind where you felt welcome in your own life, she could not honestly say when she had last had it. On his side of the bed, Caden breathed slowly and slept without interruption. He had always been a good sleeper. She had once thought this was one of his strengths. Now she wondered whether it was simply that he had nothing he could not put down. She got up quietly and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists. She looked at herself in the mirror. 28 years old, the face of a woman who was managing well on not enough rest and not enough acknowledgement. She thought about the Northwood Medical Institute. She thought about the professor who had written the note accompanying her acceptance, saying that her application had demonstrated both intelligence and genuine compassion, a combination rarer than most people assumed. She had wanted to be that person. She still wanted it. The wanting had not gone away. It had just been set aside so many times that it had almost started to feel like not wanting. Almost. She dried her hands. She went back to bed. She lay down facing the window and the thin line of moonlight at the foot of the bed. Tomorrow she had the Fenwick reply to follow up on, and Owen's discharge paperwork, and the supply correction to file, and probably 3 things she had not yet remembered that would arrive in the morning and need handling. She thought, "I will handle them. I always do." And then, quietly, to herself, in the dark, for the first time in a long time, "But is this what I want to keep handling?" The moonlight moved. The house was still. No answer came, because she had not been ready, until now, to ask the question clearly enough to hear one. 3 months before the night of the Harvest Moon Gala, on a warm afternoon at the end of summer, a delegation from the Southern Crescent Pack arrived at the Blackwood estate. There were 4 of them. Celine was in the courtyard overseeing the delivery of the autumn medical supplies when the cars came through the main gate, and she watched them from a polite distance, noting the Southern Crescent emblem on the lead vehicle and the careful formality with which they had dressed for the occasion. Formal but not stiff. The kind of presentation that said, "We have done this before." The 4th person to step out of the cars was Lyra Holt. Celine noticed her the way you notice something bright against a gray sky. Not because you were looking for it, but because your eyes simply went there. Lyra was tall, with dark hair worn loose in a way that looked effortless and deliberately considered at the same time. She moved through the courtyard with the calm of someone who had long since accepted being looked at as part of their environment. Their eyes met briefly across the courtyard. Lyra gave a small professional nod. Celine returned it. Then she went back to the supply inventory. That evening Caden hosted a welcome dinner for the delegation. Celine sat at the far end of the long table and helped keep the conversation moving during the silences, which was something she had learned to do well over the years, threading topics between people who did not know each other, asking the right questions, making the room feel more comfortable than it actually was. Lyra Holt sat 3 seats to Caden's left. She was sharp and funny, with the kind of humor that made people laugh and simultaneously feel like she was watching them. She had strong opinions about pack governance that she offered without hesitation, but without arrogance. Caden listened to her the way he rarely listened to anyone, without looking away, without reaching for his phone, without the slight distraction that had become his default in most conversations over the past 2 years. Celine told herself this meant nothing. Caden was an attentive host. He was good at focus when he chose to apply it. She did not sleep well that night, but she did not connect the insomnia to the dinner. The Southern Crescent delegation was scheduled to stay for 2 weeks. At the end of the first week, the official negotiations concluded, and 3 of the 4 members departed. Lyra Holt's stay was extended. The reason given was a minor territorial mapping project, something about a shared river boundary that needed detailed surveying. Celine reviewed the project brief when it landed on her desk, because somehow it had landed on her desk, and saw that it was legitimate if not particularly urgent. She filed it and moved on. What she could not file was the change she began to notice in Caden. It was subtle at first. He started coming to dinner with more energy. He had always been a person who could be present, or very much absent, depending on what held his attention, and for several months prior to Lyra's arrival, he had been mostly absent, present in body, and elsewhere in everything that mattered. But now he was at dinner, and he was actually there, asking questions, responding to what was said, laughing, in the full-throated way she had once loved about him. She was glad, at first. She told herself that whatever had lifted his mood was good for the pack, and good for everyone, and she was grateful for the lighter air in the house. By the 2nd week of Lyra's extended stay, she stopped being glad. It was not any single moment. It was an accumulation, the way water accumulated in a bowl left out in the rain, not all at once but steadily, until the bowl was full and starting to run over the sides. She noticed that Caden's phone was now face down on the table during meetings, something he had never done before. She noticed that his schedule, which she had always had some access to, began to show blocks of time, with initials she did not recognize. She noticed that when she tried to have a conversation with him in the evenings, he was present for the first 2 or 3 minutes, and then somewhere else, pulled by something he was not mentioning. She began doing what she had always done when something in her life felt unstable. She worked harder. She took on more. She managed more territory issues, attended more pack functions, made herself visible and useful in every way she knew how. If there was a version of Celine that Caden had forgotten, she would remind him. She would make herself impossible to overlook. She stayed up later. She woke up earlier. She lost a small amount of weight over those weeks, not deliberately but because she kept forgetting to eat, and then it was too late and she was tired. And she told herself she would eat properly tomorrow. She was always going to eat properly tomorrow. One evening in the 5th week of Lyra's stay, Celine was carrying a stack of files past the open door of Caden's private study. The door was ajar. She heard voices inside, and was moving past without slowing when she caught a fragment of what was being said, and her feet stopped before her mind had made a decision to stop them. Caden's voice, quieter than usual, more unguarded than she was used to hearing him, saying to Rowan, "She feels like home in a way Celine never did. I didn't know it could feel like that." The rest of the sentence dissolved into something she could not make out. She stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which her hands tightened on the files, and her chest did something complicated, and she looked at the grain of the floorboards under her feet, because they were something solid to look at. Then she kept walking. She went to the study, put the files in their place, and sat down at the desk, and opened the ledger she had been meaning to update. She began writing in it with a very steady hand, because her hand was steady, because she had spent 7 years building exactly the kind of control that kept hands steady in moments when they wanted very badly not to be. She worked for an hour. She went to bed before Caden came upstairs. She lay in the dark and she did not allow herself to think about what she had heard, not directly. Instead, she thought around it the way you moved around a very hot thing, close enough to feel the heat, far enough not to burn. She told herself it was a fragment of a conversation, that fragments could be misleading, that she owed it to 7 years of building something together, to wait until she understood more. She told herself a lot of things. In the morning she got up, and she was kinder to Caden than she had been in months. She made breakfast. She asked about his day. She reached across the table and touched his hand, and he looked up at her with a brief surprise that she chose not to examine too closely, and smiled, and she smiled back. That evening he came to dinner, and he was not present. His mind was somewhere else, before the food was even on the table. The weeks that followed were the worst of the 7 years, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No conversations, no confrontations, no clarifying moments. Only Caden and his increasing distance, and Lyra Holt, who moved through the estate with a growing ease that made it clear she had stopped thinking of herself as a guest, and Celine, who continued to run everything that needed running, and said nothing, and noticed everything. She ate less than she should. She slept fewer hours than her body needed. She woke some mornings with the slight dizziness of someone running on empty, and ignored it, because there was no time to address it, and she had been ignoring similar signals for months. Rowan found her one evening on the back terrace, standing in the cold with her arms folded and her eyes on the tree line. He came and stood beside her without speaking. He was good at that, being present without requiring her to explain herself. "How long have you known?" she said, without looking at him. He was quiet for a moment. "A while," he said. She nodded. Rowan was honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable. She had always relied on that. "Does the rest of the pack know?" "Some suspect." She closed her eyes briefly. 7 years. 7 years of letters and meetings and cold bread eaten standing up, and it was going to end like this, with the pack watching and waiting, and saying nothing. "I do not know what to do," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud, to anyone, in any form. Saying it to Rowan in the cold on the back terrace made it real, in a way that it had not been before. Rowan looked at her sideways. "Yes, you do," he said quietly. She did not answer. She went inside. She went to bed. She lay awake until the very early hours, thinking about what she knew, and what she had always known, and what she had been choosing, for a very long time, not to do. 3 weeks later, invitations went out for the Harvest Moon Gala. Celine received hers with the rest of the pack, a formal card with the Blackwood seal, as if she were simply a guest, and not the person who had run every detail of this event for 4 years running. Then she put it on the pile of things to handle, and began organizing the event with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, because the event still needed to happen, and it still needed to be done well, and there was no version of herself that knew how to do something badly, just because her heart was breaking while she did it. She ordered the flowers. She arranged the tables. She tasted 7 different honey cakes until she found the right one. She chose her dress, 3 weeks before the night of the gala, when she was still telling herself she might be wrong about what was coming. Deep down she knew she was not wrong. She had not been wrong about anything, for a very long time. She had simply been very determined not to be right. The gala was 6 weeks away when she chose the dress. Silver, long, simple. She had tried it on in the early afternoon, when the house was quiet, and stood in front of the mirror, and looked at herself for a long moment. She looked like a woman who was prepared. She looked like someone who had practiced keeping herself together for so long that the keeping together had become her default expression. She had not always looked like that. She remembered, distantly, being 21, and laughing at things without calculating whether the laughing was appropriate. She remembered saying what she thought without first editing it for palatability. She remembered taking up space naturally, without apology, without the persistent low-level management of how much of herself was too much. She put the dress away and went back to the supply ledgers. The weeks passed. She kept working, kept managing, kept showing up. She smiled at pack functions and answered questions and handled crises. She did not, for 6 weeks, ask Caden directly what was happening, because she was afraid, not of the answer, but of what the asking would cost her. On the morning of the Harvest Moon Gala, she woke before the alarm, and lay in the dark and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been preparing for a thing, without admitting they were preparing, that tonight was going to change everything. She got up. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up and told herself she was ready. She had given enough. She had been enough. Whatever came next, she would remain standing. She spent the morning managing the final preparations, the florist at 8, the kitchen staff and their 7 questions about the seating, The lighting issue in the East Wing that took 2 hours to resolve. By midday she had confirmed the arrival schedule and the kitchen timeline, and handled a last-minute request from a senior pack member who needed a specific accommodation. She managed it all without hurrying, without raising her voice, without letting the feeling in her chest bleed into the precision of her work. She had always been able to do this, hold private pain on one side of herself and work cleanly on the other. Standing now in the nearly finished hall, watching the gold light from the chandeliers fall across the arrangements she had chosen, and the tables she had arranged, and the space she had organized, with 3 weeks of careful effort, she thought, maybe it was not strength after all. Maybe it was simply practice, the practice of a woman who had learned to make everything around her beautiful, while the thing at the center of her life went quietly dark. She went upstairs. She put on the silver dress. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked beautiful. She had not properly noticed this about herself in some time, because beauty required a certain kind of attention that she had not been giving to herself. But standing in the silver dress in the afternoon light, she saw herself for a moment the way someone who truly loved her might see her. She touched the mirror once, lightly, with her fingertips. Then she straightened her shoulders and went downstairs. The great hall had been transformed. 500 candles burned in the chandeliers, above 300 tables covered in white linen, and the gold and white flower arrangements she had spent the morning placing made the room look like a place where important things were supposed to happen. The music was live, a string quartet she had booked 8 weeks ago, and they were playing something that sounded warm and celebratory, and slightly too loud for easy conversation. Celine stood near the entrance with a glass of wine she had taken from a passing server and had not yet touched. She was wearing the silver dress. She had swept her hair up. She had done all the things that a woman was supposed to do on the night of an event she had organized, and she looked exactly as she was supposed to look, and nobody walking past her would have known, from looking, that she had not slept more than 3 hours on any night in the past 2 weeks. She watched the room fill up. Pack members arrived in clusters, dressed for the occasion, greeting each other with the warmth of people who only gathered in large groups a few times a year. She knew most of them by name. She knew which ones had children, which ones were managing disputes with neighboring territories, which ones had lost someone in the past year, and were smiling tonight because they had decided that surviving grief was reason enough to be present. She knew their lives because she had been paying attention to them for 7 years. Nobody had asked her to. It was simply something she had done, the way she had always done everything, because a place was not a community until someone chose to hold it together. Caden was at the center of the hall, moving through the crowd the way he always did, with the ease of a man who understood that rooms rearranged themselves around him. He looked well. He was wearing the formal black jacket she had suggested 3 weeks ago, when they had briefly discussed what to wear, and she had a strange, dislocating thought that she had chosen this for him too. She had chosen almost everything he wore to formal occasions because he had asked her to in the early years, and had simply never stopped asking, and she had never stopped choosing. Lyra Holt was nearby. She was wearing red. Of course she was wearing red. Celine took a small sip of wine. She held the glass carefully and looked at the room she had decorated, full of people she knew, buzzing with the energy of a night that felt important. And she thought, whatever happens tonight, I want to remember that I did this, that I made this possible, that this room is beautiful and running smoothly because of me, regardless of what anyone says or does not say. She held that thought. It was a small thing to hold against the size of the fear underneath it, but it was hers. Rowan appeared at her side. He had an expression she recognized, the one he wore when he knew something and could not decide whether saying it would help. "You look well," he said. "Thank you." She turned to look at him directly. "How long has he been planning this?" Rowan met her eyes. He did not pretend not to understand the question. "I did not know the exact timing," he said, "until today." She nodded. She believed him. Rowan was honest, even when honesty cost him. "All right," she said. "Celine." "I am all right, Rowan." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She turned back toward the room. Caden climbed the 2 low steps onto the platform near the fireplace at 9 o'clock. The music stopped. The conversation died in waves. 500 people turned to face their Alpha King, with the automatic attention of a pack that had been trained from childhood to listen when its leader spoke. Celine was standing near the back wall, by the long side table with the wine and the small plates of things she had chosen. She held her wine glass and stood very still. "This is a night I have been thinking about for some time," Caden said. His voice moved through the hall without effort, the deep and certain voice of a man who had never had to fight to be heard. "There are decisions a leader puts off, not because he doubts them, but because he is not ready to speak them out loud. Tonight I am ready." The room was very quiet. The quiet had a texture. Celine could feel it against her skin. "The Blackwood Pack has always been built on strength and honesty," he continued. "You deserve both from me tonight." He paused. "The bond I held with Celine Voss was real, and it served its time. But it has run its course. I am formally releasing it tonight." A held breath moved through the room. 500 people inhaling at once, and not quite exhaling. Celine did not move. "And I am honored to claim Lyra Holt as the Blackwood Luna, the woman who will stand at my side going forward." Lyra stepped up onto the platform. She was confident and composed, and had clearly done this kind of thing before, standing in important rooms and smiling at important people, and understanding exactly what the moment required. The applause began somewhere in the front of the hall, and spread backward through the crowd in a slow wave. Celine stood at the back of the room, and listened to 500 people applaud the end of her life in this place. People she had helped, people she had fed and bandaged and listened to over years. She became aware of several things simultaneously. Her hand was very tight around the wine glass. Someone nearby was watching her, with the sideways look of a person, waiting to see how she would respond to a public wound. Rowan was somewhere to her left, not speaking, not moving, giving her the only gift he could in this moment, which was silence and the absence of pity. She loosened her grip on the wine glass. She looked at it for a moment, the red wine still mostly full, the thin rim, the clear glass that caught the candlelight. She set it down on the table beside her, carefully, without sound. She smoothed the front of her silver dress. She picked up a small folded napkin from the table and placed it precisely where her glass had been, because she was a person who cleaned up after herself. And then she walked out. She did not run. She did not shout. She did not look at Caden, or at Lyra, or at the 500 people whose applause was still ringing in the corridor behind her. She walked through the tall front doors of the estate and out into the night air, which was cold enough that she felt it immediately through the fabric of her dress, and she kept walking, until the lights of the hall were behind her, and the sound was swallowed by distance. She walked until she reached the frozen lake at the far edge of the estate grounds. She sat down in the snow at the edge of the water, in her silver dress, and looked at the ice. The moon was up. It laid a white sheen across the surface of the lake, and made everything look clean, and still, and very far away from human beings. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry. She was not certain whether this meant she was strong, or simply that she had used up her crying somewhere in the past 2 years, without noticing when it happened. She thought about 7 years as if she were reading them from a list. The first border letter she had written at 22, nervous and certain she would get it wrong. The medical supplies she had reorganized in year 2, creating a system that Dorothy still used. The 3 peace agreements in years 3 and 4 and 5, none of which bore her name. The supply ledgers and the water rights meetings and the diplomatic dinners and the long mornings in the medical wing and the evenings she had sat across from Caden, telling herself that the love she was giving was building something that would last. It had not built something that would last. It had simply been taken. She heard Rowan's footsteps in the snow behind her. He stopped a few feet back. "Go back inside," she said. "Celine." "Please, Rowan." There was a silence, then footsteps retreating. She sat alone. She did not know how long she was there before she got up and walked back. She went in through the side entrance, climbed the stairs, went into the room she had shared with Caden. She changed out of her dress. She folded it with care and placed it in the wardrobe. She lay down on her side of the bed in the dark. In the morning, she told herself, she would begin to pack. She would decide where to go. She would figure out what shape a life looked like when you built it for yourself. She closed her eyes. The pressure in her chest was familiar. It had been there for months, she realized now. A low and constant weight that she had managed by staying busy. Without the busyness to contain it, it sat very still and very heavy. She thought, tomorrow. I will make decisions tomorrow. I will know what to do tomorrow. The pressure in her chest, which she had learned to manage and manage and manage, had been building since long before tonight, and now, without the management and the lists and the meetings to hold it in place, it moved. It moved, and it did not stop, and she was too tired to do what she should have done, which was get up and knock on a door and ask for help. She had spent 7 years not asking for help. She was very practiced at it. She thought about Mira's pale blue envelope and the door that was still open. The thought dissolved before she could reach for it. The last thing she was aware of was the silence of the room, and the cold seeping in around the window frame, and somewhere outside, the frozen lake lying still under the moon, clean and white and indifferent to everything that happened on its shore. She did not wake up. 3 days later, the pack doctor, a gentle-faced man named Dr. Philip Cole, would tell Rowan in a quiet hallway that it had been heart failure, brought on by extreme physical and emotional exhaustion. He would say that her body had been under severe and sustained strain for many months. He would say that the collapse had not come from the gala alone, but from everything that had come before it. Everything that had gone unaddressed and unacknowledged and unrelieved, accumulated over years, until there was nothing left to carry it. Rowan would not speak for a very long time. Caden would not speak at all. And in the wardrobe of their shared room, a silver dress would hang in careful folds, the last thing she had done before she lay down, the last gesture of a woman who had taken care of everything, right to the end, including the small matter of tidying after herself. She had been 3 days short of her 29th birthday. She had given everything she had, and then she had given a little more, and that was what it had cost her. She had not been seen. She had simply been used up. She opened her eyes to the wooden ceiling of her childhood bedroom. The beams were the same ones she had stared at as a girl, counting the knots in the wood on nights she could not sleep. The quilt over her was her grandmother's, a thing of faded blue and yellow squares, soft from 2 decades of washing. Outside the single window, the oak tree she had climbed every summer until she was 15, stood in its usual place, bare-branched in the cold morning light. She lay still. Her first breath was careful, the kind you took when you were not entirely sure of the surface you were on. Her second breath was steadier. By the third she had identified the smell of the room, the particular pine and wool and old wood smell of the house she had grown up in, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was back. She was 22 years old. She was alive. She did not move immediately. She lay on her back under her grandmother's quilt and looked at the wooden ceiling, and let the understanding settle through her the way water settled into dry ground, slowly, in layers, changing everything it touched. She remembered everything. She remembered the dispatch rider at 7 in the morning and the red seal on the Fenwick letter. She remembered Dorothy's hands placing a piece of bread in her palm without comment. She remembered Owen asking if it was normal for people to stay outside in the cold for someone they loved, and her saying yes, and meaning it. She remembered Mira's pale blue envelope and the careful handwriting of a sister who had kept a door open long past when most people would have closed it. She remembered Lyra Holt in red, stepping up onto the platform in the candle-lit hall. She remembered the frozen lake, the silver dress she had folded and hung before lying down, the moonlight on the ice, the pressure in her chest that she had managed for too long and then, finally, could not manage anymore. She lay with all of it for several minutes. Not with grief exactly, though grief was present. Not with anger, though that was present too, quiet and clean and not yet fully named. She lay with it the way she had lain with so many things in her life, carefully, taking inventory, waiting until she understood the full shape of something before she decided what to do with it. The understanding, when it finished settling, was precise and complete. She had been given something back. She did not know by what force or what logic. She was not someone who required explanations before she acted on facts. And the fact was this: she was 22 years old, she was in her childhood bedroom, and she remembered everything that had happened in a life she had not yet lived. She had 7 years of knowledge, and none of the damage yet, not in her body, not in her health, not in the slow erosion of a self that had been spent on someone who did not value the spending. She had the damage as memory, as experience, as the specific understanding of someone who had been through a long and punishing thing and come out knowing its full weight. That was the gift, not the youth, not the second chance in the abstract sense that the phrase suggested, the knowledge, given back early enough to matter. She took a long breath. Then she got up. The room was cold. She pulled on the thick cardigan hanging on the back of the desk chair, the desk where she had done her schoolwork as a girl, where she had first looked up medical terminology with the serious dedication of a 15-year-old who had decided what she wanted to do with her life. She sat in the chair and pulled her knees up and looked at the window. The first decision had already been made. It had been made in that room by the frozen lake, in the moment she understood what the 7 years had cost. And it had been made again, in the first second she opened her eyes on this ceiling. She was not going to Caden. She was not going to walk back into the orbit of the Blackwood Pack as a convenience, as a sacrifice, as a person who shaped herself around someone else's needs and called it love. She was never going to let herself be that person again. That was not anger speaking. She knew the difference between anger and clarity, because she had spent 7 years confusing them, mistaking her exhaustion for patience, her silence for understanding, her shrinking for love. This was clarity. It had no heat to it. It was simply a fact, as stable as the wooden ceiling above her head. She thought next about what she wanted, not what she owed, not what was expected, not what would make someone else's life easier. What she, Celine Voss, actually wanted. The list assembled itself quickly, because she had been carrying it for years without permission to act on it. She wanted to enroll in the medical training program. The acceptance letter from the Northwood Medical Institute had arrived 3 months ago in this version of her life, which meant it was sitting somewhere in the pile of post on the downstairs table that her father sorted on Tuesdays. She was going to find it, and she was going to enroll. She wanted to call Mira, not in a few weeks, not when she had time, not with an apology and an explanation that was technically true but insufficient. She was going to call her today, and she was going to be honest, and she was going to start building back what she had spent 7 years letting quietly fall apart. She wanted to spend real time with her father Felix, who was a quiet and decent man who had once told her, when she was 18, that the thing he was most proud of was that she knew her own mind. She had spent a decade proving him wrong. She intended to spend this life proving him right. She wanted friends, real ones, not the careful professional connections she had maintained in her first life as extensions of her role, but actual people who knew her, who knew what she liked and how she thought, and what made her laugh in the real way, rather than the social way. She wanted to sleep a full night and eat proper meals and wake up without immediately running a mental inventory of what needed to be handled for someone else. She wanted to live in her own life. The list was simple. It had always been simple. It had simply required the specific knowledge of what the other path cost, in full and in every detail, before she could stand at the beginning of it and choose differently. She stood up. She went to the bathroom and washed her face. She looked at herself in the mirror, 22 years old, clear-eyed, with the face of someone who had just made a decision and intended to keep it. She went downstairs. Her father was at the kitchen table with his tea and his newspaper, the way he always was on mornings when he did not have to leave early. He was a broad-shouldered, quiet man, with reading glasses and gray at his temples that had been coming in since his early 40s. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have been different enough from the usual, because his expression shifted slightly, a question forming that he did not ask. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. "You are up early." "I have things to do." She poured herself tea from the pot he had already made and sat across from him. He went back to his newspaper. She looked at the pile of post on the end of the table, and there it was, third from the top, the Northwood Medical Institute envelope with the formal seal. She pulled it out of the pile and held it. She did not need to open it. She already knew what it said. She already knew the name of the professor who had written the accompanying note and the precise wording of the description of her application. "That has been sitting there 3 weeks, her father said, not looking up. "I know. You have not opened it." "I know." A pause. Felix turned a page of his newspaper. "Is there a reason?" She thought about the 7 years, about the supply ledgers, and the diplomatic letters, and the cold bread eaten standing up in an empty kitchen. About the night she had folded her silver dress and put it in a wardrobe and lain down in the dark and not gotten up again. "Not anymore," she said. She opened the envelope. She read the letter, her letter, the one she had kept in a desk drawer for 5 years in another life, soft at the folds, from too much reading and too little acting. She set it down on the kitchen table and said, to her father's newspaper, "I am going to enroll." Felix lowered his newspaper and looked at her over the top of his glasses, with the careful attention of a father who had been waiting for something without knowing quite what. "Good," he said. He said it without fanfare and went back to his paper, but she saw him reach for his tea, with the particular steadiness of a man who has just had something he was worried about resolved. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light, with the acceptance letter in front of her, and her father's newspaper rustling gently nearby, and the tea warm in her hands, and she felt something she had not felt in 7 years. She felt like herself. After breakfast, she went to the back steps and called Mira. The phone rang 4 times, which was how long it took Mira to answer whenever she was at work. The particular rhythm of someone who checked the caller, decided it was worth pausing for, and needed a moment to get somewhere she could talk. "Celine." Mira's voice held something careful in it, the wariness of a person who had been hurt by someone they loved, and had not yet decided whether it was safe to be open with them again. "Hi," Celine said. She was sitting on the back steps of her father's house, looking at the bare winter lawn. "I wanted to call. I have been meaning to call." "You have been meaning to call for a while," Mira said, not unkindly, just accurately. "I know." Celine let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, "I am sorry. I am not going to give you a list of reasons, because I think I have given you enough lists of reasons, and I know you understand them, and I know they do not actually change what they were, which is that I kept choosing other things over you, so I am just saying I am sorry." A silence. Then Mira said, quietly, "Are you all right?" And Celine, because she had just come back from the only life in which she had learned what not all right really felt like, said honestly, "I think I am going to be." Mira was quiet for another moment. Then, "Okay." And then, "I am working until 3. Can I call you back?" "Yes." "Okay." A pause. "Celine." "Yes." "It is good to hear your voice." Celine closed her eyes. "Yours too," she said. She sat on the back steps after she hung up and let the cold morning air come in around her, and thought about Mira calling back at 3, and about the medical enrollment form she was going to submit today, and about the 2 things she had done this morning that she had not done in her first life until there was no more time to do them. She went inside. She sat at her father's old desk and began filling in the enrollment form. It took 40 minutes. She read it back once, checked every line, and submitted it before noon. Then she looked around the room, at the house she had grown up in, and the garden outside the window, and the oak tree bare against the pale winter sky, and she thought, "I am 22 years old, and I remember what it cost to get this wrong. I am not going to get it wrong." She went to find the list of things that needed doing in her actual, present life, and started at the top. The Northwood Medical Institute was a 3-hour drive from her father's house, which meant that on mornings with early classes, she either made the drive in the dark or slept in a small rented room near campus that she paid for out of her part-time work at a community health center 3 evenings a week. She had not told anyone in the PAC world where she had enrolled. She had not thought about the PAC world at all, which was the remarkable thing, the ease with which she had simply stepped back from the edge of it and into her own life, the way stepping back from a ledge should always feel, like relief. The medical program was hard. It was the specific kind of hard that she had always known it would be, requiring the same precision and sustained attention that she had always had, but now directed entirely inward, at her own learning, her own development, her own understanding. There was nobody else's agenda. There was just the material, and what she made of it. She was good at it, better than she had expected, which meant she had been underestimating herself, which was a discovery that arrived with complicated feelings attached. Her study partner was a woman named Nora, who was 23, from the East Coast, and possessed of the particular combination of brilliant and chaotic that made her simultaneously very effective in a crisis and extremely unreliable about returning library books. They had been assigned to work together on a practical assessment in the 3rd week, and had ended up talking for 2 hours after the session about the ethics of PAC medical practice, and by the end of it, they were friends in the straightforward way that sometimes happened when 2 people recognized something honest in each other. Celine had not had a friend like this in years. She had had allies and acquaintances and people she knew professionally and well, but not a friend who called her on a Wednesday evening to ask what she thought about a case study, and then talked for an hour about something entirely unrelated. It felt, surprisingly and intensely, like something she had not known she was missing until it was there. Mira called back at 3 on the day Celine had enrolled, and they talked for 2 hours, and then they talked again 3 days later, and then it became a regular thing. Tuesday and Friday evenings, usually, because those were the evenings that worked for both of them. The regularity of it was something that Celine found steadying in a way she could not immediately explain. She thought about it one evening, while walking back to her rented room, after a long session at the health center. She thought, the steadiness comes from reliability, from knowing that the thing will be there when you show up for it. She had always been reliable for other people. She had never built enough reliable things for herself. She went home to her father's house every third weekend. Felix was not a man who expressed things directly, but he had a way of having her favorite tea ready when she arrived, and a way of sitting with her in the kitchen, without needing conversation to fill the space. And over those months, she learned something she had not known about him, that he had been lonely since her mother left 12 years ago, and had been managing it with the same quiet competence with which Celine managed everything, and had found in her absence over the past years a kind of resigned sadness that he had never mentioned, because she had not given him the openings. She gave him the openings now. They talked slowly at first, in the way that two people talked when they had accumulated a lot of things worth saying, and were still learning that it was safe to say them. He told her about the year she was 8 and had broken her wrist falling from the oak tree, and he had held her hand in the hospital waiting room, and promised himself he would do a better job of teaching her to ask for help, and then had not known how to keep that promise. She told him she thought he had done a good job. "I did not," he said. "You did the best you could," she said. He considered this. "Those are not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "But the intention matters. It means something, even when the execution falls short." He looked at her with the expression of a father who had just heard something from his daughter that suggested she had grown up in ways he had not entirely witnessed. "When did you get so wise?" he said. She thought about the medical wing, and the water rights meetings, and the frozen lake, and the wooden ceiling of this bedroom where she had woken up. "I had an education," she said, which was not untrue, even if the curriculum had been brutal. The medical program moved into its second semester, and Celine moved with it, discovering things about herself in the process. She was excellent at diagnosis, at holding multiple pieces of information simultaneously, and finding the thread that connected them. She was good in crises, calm where other students panicked. She was not always good at asking for clarification when she did not understand something, because she had a deeply ingrained habit of figuring things out alone, and it took Nora calling her on it in their 5th month of studying together before she began to genuinely work on it. "You do this thing," Nora said one evening over very bad coffee in the library, "where you almost ask a question, and then you do not." "I was going to look it up," Celine said. "You could also just ask Dr. Warren," Nora said, with the direct simplicity of someone who had not spent years learning not to make requests. Celine looked at her. "Does that feel easy to you? Just asking?" Nora thought about it. "Mostly," she said. "Why? Does it not feel easy to you?" Celine considered how to answer. "I had some practice being a person who did not ask," she said finally. Nora looked at her for a moment. "Well," she said, "you are in a different practice now." And Celine thought, yes, that was exactly right. She was in a different practice now. Everything was practice, in the end. You practiced the version of yourself you intended to become, until it became the version you were, and then you kept going. She practiced asking questions. She practiced eating proper meals at proper times, instead of forgetting, and then catching up at odd hours. She practiced sleeping a full night, without the particular alertness of someone who expected to be needed before morning. She practiced spending time with Mira and Felix without the guilt and the managed distance that had become her default. She was, she discovered, quite good at being present when she was not also carrying the weight of everyone else's agenda. The pack world moved along around her, following its patterns and its politics and its hierarchies, and she moved through it like a person who knew the map well and was choosing a different route. She was not hiding from it. She still lived within its social structures, still attended community gatherings, still knew who held what position and how the alliances were shifting, because this knowledge was part of her, woven into 7 years of paying close attention. She just did not put herself at its center anymore. She knew, with the precision of someone who had already seen the sequence play out, that within a certain number of months Caden Blackwood would enter her life again. There was an Interpack summit scheduled for the spring, the same summit that in her previous life had led to a series of events she had been too young and too unguarded to properly evaluate. He would be there, she would be there too, because her own standing in the pack community was sufficient to warrant an invitation, and because her father's name carried weight, and she was proud to stand beside it. She was not afraid of going. She was not building herself up for it either. She simply knew that it was coming, and she intended to meet it as the woman she was now, rather than the woman she had been. That was the only preparation she needed. The months passed. She studied. She worked her evenings at the health center and developed real skills under the supervision of a senior healer named Dr. Arthur Finch, who was demanding and exacting, and told her once, without sentiment, that she had good instincts and the discipline to develop them into something reliable. She took the compliment and filed it carefully. She and Nora developed the habit of going for long walks on Sunday afternoons, which was something Celine had not done in years. Walked without a destination, without a task to complete, without anything waiting to be handled at the other end. She was learning to be in her own life. It was slower than managing someone else's, and quieter. And sometimes she felt the absence of urgency the way you felt the absence of a noise you had been living with so long you had stopped hearing it, as a brief disorienting silence, and then as something close to peace. One Sunday in late winter, walking back from a long circular route with Nora through the bare fields west of campus, the sun already low and the air very cold and clean, Celine thought, I am happy. Not the complicated, managed, achieved against difficulty feeling she had been confusing with happiness for years. Just happiness, the simple, inhabitable kind, where you felt welcome in your own life. She did not say it out loud. She held it quietly and walked through the cold and the late sunlight and thought, I built this. Not the medical program or the friendship or the Sunday walks individually. All of it together. The whole shape of these months. I built it by choosing, one thing at a time, what I actually wanted. It was not finished. She was not finished. There was a clinic she was going to build, eventually, in a border zone that needed one, and there were patients she had not yet treated, and knowledge she had not yet earned, and places she had not yet been. There was a great deal still ahead, but she was happy now, in the middle of the not finished, and that was something she had not previously understood was available to her. Happiness as a present condition, rather than a future reward for enough sacrifice. She had a summit to attend in 6 weeks. She was not the same person she had been the last time the world had offered her a particular sequence of choices. She intended to make different ones. The Interpack Summit took place in the last week of March, in a conference hall at the neutral meeting grounds 3 hours north of the Blackwood territory. It ran for 3 days, covering trade agreements, boundary updates, and the annual review of shared security protocols. Celine attended as part of the Voss family delegation, modest but respected, because her father had been a reliable voice in Interpack governance for 20 years, and his name carried weight without requiring performance. She wore dark blue on the first day. She had done her hair simply. She carried a leather notebook and 2 pens, because she always lost one. The conference hall was set up in a large ground-floor room, with tables arranged in a broad arc facing a central presentation area. She found her family's designated seats midway through the arc, at a good angle for both seeing and being seen, and she settled in and opened her notebook and felt, with pleasant clarity, completely herself. She had been sitting for perhaps 20 minutes, reviewing the morning agenda, when she became aware of the quality of the air in the room shifting slightly. The specific shift that happened when a certain kind of person entered a space, and the space rearranged itself in response, whether it meant to or not. She did not look up immediately. She made a small note in the margin of her agenda. She finished the note. Then she looked up. Caden Blackwood was at the entrance to the hall, with 4 members of his delegation flanking him, and he was doing what he always did in rooms, which was existing in them with a completeness that most people only achieved when they were the subject of everyone's attention. He was 27 years old in this life, which was how old he had been when they first properly met the first time, and he looked exactly as she remembered him looking then, broad-shouldered, commanding, with the quality of a man who had been trained since childhood to lead, and had found it natural. She looked at him steadily for about 3 seconds, the way you looked at something you had already accounted for and were simply confirming. Then she went back to her notes. She heard the Blackwood delegation find their seats. She kept her attention on her notebook and the agenda in front of her, and the particular satisfaction of knowing exactly where she was and what she was doing. The morning session was productive. There were substantive conversations about the eastern border water allocation, which she had opinions about and noted carefully. There was also an interesting presentation about a new shared medical resource protocol that made her think of Dr. Finch and the work she had been doing at the health center. At the midday break, she went to get tea from the refreshment table. She was considering the sandwiches when she became aware of someone moving toward her with the particular deliberateness of a person who has identified their destination. "You are Felix Voss's daughter," said Caden Blackwood. She looked at him. He was standing approximately 3 feet away, with the slightly unfocused quality of a man who had just said something he had not entirely planned to say. He recovered quickly, the slight reset of posture, the return of control, but the initial moment had been genuine. "Yes," she said. "Celine Voss." "Caden Blackwood." "I know," she said. She said it pleasantly, without subtext, because there was no point in subtext, and she was no longer interested in things without points. Something crossed his face. A brief recalibration. He was, she remembered, accustomed to reactions when he introduced himself, the flicker of recognition, the slight adjustment in posture, the unconscious response of most people to the presence of an alpha king. She had simply acknowledged knowing his name, and offered nothing further. "Your father has been a strong voice on the boundary review," he said. "He has a lot of experience with it," she agreed. She picked up a cup of tea and held it in both hands. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the look that she recognized from the inside, the pull that had no good explanation, the thing that her wolf nature registered before her reasoning could catch up. She felt it too, and found that feeling it was informative and nothing more. "Are you involved in pack governance?" he asked. "I am training in medicine," she said, "but the governance interests me." "The water allocation discussion this morning," he said. "You were taking notes throughout." "I was. Most people were not." "Most people do not find it interesting," she said. "I do." He looked at her with the full attention she remembered him being capable of when he chose to apply it, the kind of look that made you feel briefly like the only person in the room. She looked back at him with the steady warmth of someone who knew the difference between attention and care, and was not susceptible to the first one pretending to be the second. "It was good to meet you," she said, and she meant it. She finished her tea, set the cup down, and went to find her father. She did not look back. She was aware, without needing to check, that he was watching her cross the room. The afternoon sessions were less interesting than the morning ones, but she paid attention to all of them, and her notebook was detailed and organized by the time the day ended. She had dinner with her father and a small group of other PAC representatives at a restaurant near the Summit Hall, and she talked about the water allocation proposal and the medical resource protocol, and found the evening genuinely enjoyable. She did not think about Caden very much during dinner. This pleased her. By the second day of the summit, she had become aware that he was noticing her. It was not dramatic. He was too skilled a politician for anything dramatic in a professional context. But she could feel the directional nature of his attention in a room, the way you felt the direction of a draft before you could identify its source. Twice during the morning session, she looked up from her notes and found his eyes already on her from across the arc of tables. Both times, she held his gaze briefly, and then returned to what she had been doing. At the afternoon break, he sent Rowan. Rowan, who in this life had not yet met her, came over with the easy manner of a man who was good at these approaches, and introduced himself, and they had a pleasant conversation about the morning sessions. Then he mentioned, with the practiced casualness of a man delivering a specific message, that Alpha Blackwood had very much enjoyed speaking with her the previous day, and wondered whether she might want to join the Blackwood delegation for the evening reception. She listened to all of this, and then said, warmly and clearly, "Please tell him I appreciate the invitation. I have plans with my father's group this evening." Rowan looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he said, "Of course," and she thanked him, and they parted. She saw Caden later that evening, across a crowded reception she attended briefly, before finding a polite exit. He was talking to 3 other pack leaders, and he looked up at exactly the moment she was looking in his direction, which was not something she had intended, but which was perhaps unavoidable. They exchanged a brief nod from across the room, and that was the end of it. She said goodnight to her father and went to her room and slept well. By the third day of the summit, she had received a written note, very short and very politely worded, asking if she would be willing to speak with him before the closing session. She read it, wrote a short, equally polite note in reply, explaining that she had a prior commitment, and gave it to the hall messenger. On the drive home with her father, Felix was quiet for the first half hour. Then he said, without preamble, "Caden Blackwood asked Rowan to find out your name on the first evening." Celine looked out the window at the passing trees. "I know," she said. Felix was quiet again. Then, "He is a good alpha, by most accounts." "By most accounts," she agreed. Another pause. "You are not interested." She turned to look at her father. He was watching the road with the studied neutrality of a man who was asking without quite asking. "Not at this point," she said. He nodded once and said nothing more, and she was grateful for it. She stared at the passing trees and thought about the 3 days and the notes and Rowan's approach, and the look on Caden's face when she had said it was good to meet him, and meant it, and walked away. She thought about the pull she had felt and had not acted on, because feeling a thing and choosing it were two entirely different things, and she had learned the hard way what it cost to confuse them. He was not the man she had known for 7 years yet. He was the beginning of that man, 27 and capable, and accustomed to being met with openness when he directed his attention at something. He had not yet made the choices that would make him who he would become in that other life. Neither had she. She had, however, already lived through the version of this story where she said yes. She knew how it ended. She was not going to spend this life reading the same story twice. The invitations started arriving 3 weeks after the summit. The first was a formal packed dinner hosted by the Blackwood estate, for which her family delegation was extended a courtesy invitation. She sent her regrets and a small gift of fine northern tea, which was the correct protocol, and communicated nothing beyond proper acknowledgement. The second was a personal note, brief and direct, asking if she would be willing to meet for coffee in the neutral ground market town the following weekend. The handwriting was clear and slightly pressed, a person accustomed to writing formal documents who was making an effort to write something informal. She wrote back, "Thank you for the invitation. She was busy that weekend. She hoped the summit follow-up meetings had been productive." The third was an invitation to a border advisory meeting, which was legitimate and PAC business-related, and had her father's name on it as well. She attended the meeting with her father, sat 3 seats down from Caden, contributed 2 useful observations about the southern boundary water rights issue, and at the end of the meeting, left with her father, while Caden was being detained by a question from a senior advisor. The invitations continued through April and into May. They were never inappropriate. They were always properly worded. They ranged from the formal to the gently personal, and they were all declined, each time with the warmth of someone who respected the gesture and was choosing, clearly and without apology, not to accept it. She heard through the PAC network, as she had always heard things through the PAC network, that Alpha Blackwood's interest in Felix Voss's daughter was being noted. The PAC network noted most things. She acknowledged the information, filed it, and continued with her second semester examinations. She saw Caden 3 times over those months, at events she could not decline without professional discourtesy. Each time she was pleasant and warm and entirely herself. Each time she felt his attention, and found it interesting, but insufficient cause to act. She was a person who had spent 7 years confusing attention with love, and she was done with that particular confusion. In June she attended a border management meeting at a neutral site, at the invitation of the Eastern Territory representatives, because her work with the health center had involved her in some of the border community health planning, and her input had been requested. She did not know until she arrived that the Blackwood PAC had also sent a representative. She came through the door of the meeting room and saw Caden Blackwood sitting at the table. He looked up at the same moment. He seemed to not quite conceal a brief flicker of something, not triumph exactly, but the specific intensity of a person who has been patient for a long time and finds themselves unexpectedly in the same room as the thing they have been patient about. She sat down at the opposite side of the table and opened her notebook. The meeting lasted 4 hours. She focused on it fully and contributed clearly. She was good at meetings. She had always been good at them, and she was learning to accept that without making it complicated. After the meeting, Most of the attendees moved into the corridor for refreshments and informal conversation. She was speaking with the Eastern Territory Health Liaison about the border clinic proposal when she became aware of Caden positioning himself at a respectful distance, clearly waiting. She finished her conversation with the health liaison, shook his hand, and turned to face Caden. They were relatively alone, people in the corridor 20 feet away, voices and movement, but no one within immediate earshot. She stood with her notebook under her arm and waited. He looked at her for a moment. He had, she noticed, the expression of a man who had prepared something, and was slightly uncertain of it now that the moment was here. "I have tried several times," he said, "through proper channels, and less formal ones. You have declined every invitation." "I have," she agreed. "I would like to understand why." She looked at him. He was serious and direct, and asking a real question, without pretending it was a casual one, and she found that she respected this, even as she held firmly to the answer. "May I be honest?" she said. "Please." She thought for a moment about how much to give him. Not the full truth. The full truth was something she could not have been believed, and something she did not owe him. But something honest. Something true from what was available. "I have a very clear sense of what I want my life to look like," she said. "I have built it carefully. I protect it carefully." She paused. "When something enters your life from outside, you have to ask whether it adds to what you are building, or whether it costs you something you cannot afford to lose." He was listening with full attention. She continued. "You are someone who takes up a great deal of space," she said, and she said it without unkindness, because it was simply accurate. "You have to be, to do what you do. And I have learned, through experience I will not detail, that when someone like you enters the life of someone like me, the cost is usually borne on one side." He was quiet for a moment. "You do not know me," he said. "No," she agreed. "I could be entirely wrong about you." "Then why not find out?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I know what you cost," she said, "even if you do not yet." The words landed in the air between them and stayed there. She watched him try to understand them, watched him search for a gap he could argue through and not find one. "That is not a fair judgment," he said finally. "It might not be," she said. "I am not offering it as a judgment of you. I am telling you my decision about myself." She straightened her notebook under her arm. "I think you are capable of being a good alpha. I think you may be capable of quite a lot, but what you are capable of is not my project." She met his eyes directly. "I have my own projects." She said it without coldness, without cruelty, without the bitterness of someone settling an old score. She said it the way she said true things, clearly and with the intention of being understood. Then she went to find the health liaison because they had not finished discussing the clinic proposal, and she had 3 useful thoughts she had not yet shared. She felt Caden's eyes on her back as she crossed the corridor. She did not turn around. Driving home that evening, she noticed that she felt steady, not triumphant, not vindicated, not sad. Simply steady, the way you felt after doing something difficult that you had been certain of doing from the start. She thought about the 7 years and the frozen lake, and the morning she had woken up in her childhood bedroom under her grandmother's quilt. She thought about what it had cost her to love someone as a project, and what it had cost her to be someone else's convenience, and she thought about the steadiness she felt now, and recognized it for what it was, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of herself. She was 23 years old in this life. She had a medical program to complete, a clinic proposal to develop, a father who left the tea ready when she arrived, and a sister who called on Tuesday evenings, and a friend named Nora who would call tonight or tomorrow to ask about the meeting and end up talking about something completely different. She had her projects. They were enough. They were more than enough. They were hers. She got home at 7 in the evening. Her rented room near campus was small and warm, and had a window that looked out onto the street below, and she made herself tea, and sat at the desk and opened her textbook to the chapter she had been meaning to get through for 3 days. The chapter was about diagnostic pathways for respiratory infections in communities with limited access to specialist care, and it was exactly the kind of thing she intended to spend her professional life doing something about. Her phone lit up at 9. A message from Nora. "How was the meeting?" She replied, "Productive." Ran into Caden Blackwood. 3 dots appeared, then, "The Alpha King? How was that?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she typed, "It was fine." I said what I needed to say. Nora took a moment. Then, "Are you okay?" Celine looked at the question and found that she was, quite genuinely, okay. Not performing okay, not managing okay, just, okay. She typed back, "Yes, genuinely." Nora sent a brief affirmation and then, true to form, pivoted entirely to asking whether Celine had looked at the clinical assessment rubric because Nora had a question about the second criterion. They messaged back and forth about the criterion for 20 minutes, resolved the question, and said goodnight. Celine closed her textbook. She lay on her narrow rented bed with her hands folded on her chest and stared at the ceiling of a room that was entirely her own, and thought, "Tomorrow I will go back to the health center, and I will speak to the clinic coordinator about the border proposal, and I will attend my afternoon practicum, and I will call Mira at 7. That is exactly what I want tomorrow to contain." Then she closed her eyes and slept, and it was full and untroubled, the sleep of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. The words stayed with him. Caden drove back from the border meeting with Rowan in the passenger seat and the Blackwood territory opening ahead of them in the gray afternoon, and he thought about 4 words he could not get to stay in their proper place. "Because I know what you cost." She had said it without anger. That was the part he kept returning to. There had been no bitterness in it, no wound, no claim on him. She had said it the way she said everything, clearly, and with the intention of being understood, and he had understood it, and he did not like what he understood. He thought about what it meant for someone to look at him and see a cost before they had experienced one. He thought about the precision of it, not a fear, not a hesitation, not the standard wariness of someone uncertain of his intentions, a knowledge. She had said, "I know what you cost." Past tense, in effect, a thing already learned. He thought about this for 3 days. On the 4th day he did something he had not done in a long time, which was look at himself with the specific and uncomfortable honesty that other people applied to things outside themselves. He sat in his study on an evening when the house was quiet, and he thought about what kind of man he actually was, not the version he performed for the pack and for the council and for the world, but the version underneath. The version underneath was less flattering. He was good at being necessary. He was good at occupying space and commanding attention and making decisions that people trusted. He was less good at the things that did not have an audience, at the sustained, quiet effort of caring about someone when there was nothing to perform about it, at noticing what people needed when what they needed was small and quiet and not particularly impressive to provide. He thought about Rowan, who had been his beta for 5 years and who absorbed his moods without complaint and who was, Caden now saw with sudden clarity, possibly the most loyal person in his orbit, and who he had thanked properly fewer times than he could count on one hand. He thought about the junior advisors he talked over in meetings, without meaning to. He thought about the pack members he greeted at formal occasions with precise friendliness, and whose actual lives he did not know. He thought about what it would mean to be someone that another person looked at and saw a cost without having experienced one, and he understood that it meant he had a reputation, not the reputation he performed, but a true one, built from enough consistent evidence that someone had arrived at a conclusion about him before he had given her specific cause. That was sobering in the specific way that sobering things were. It was not comfortable, and it was not avoidable, and the only useful thing to do with it was decide what to change. 2 weeks after the border meeting, Lyra Holt arrived at the Blackwood estate. Her arrival was not so different from what it had been in his memory, the fragmented and inexplicable sense of having been here before, of knowing how this sequence played out if he let it. He could not name the memory. It did not have clear edges, but it had a weight, and the weight was a warning. She was brilliant and magnetic, and immediately at ease in any room she entered, and the Southern Crescent diplomatic visit was legitimate, and the mapping project that extended her stay was real. He greeted her with proper hospitality, and found her company genuinely engaging. She was sharp, and she had opinions worth discussing. He was also, now, paying a different kind of attention. He saw, underneath the sharpness and the ease and the charm that filled rooms, what the want in her eyes was actually aimed at. It was not aimed at him, at Caden the person. It was aimed at the position, the territory, the title. She wanted to stand beside the Blackwood throne with the particular hunger of someone who saw it as a goal rather than a consequence of genuine connection. He could see it clearly, in a way he could not have named 6 months ago, before a woman in a corridor had told him he was a cost, before she had experienced him, and walked away without once looking back. He kept Lyra at professional distance, warm and appropriate and nothing more. She was perceptive enough to understand this quickly, and recalibrated without comment, which told him something about her intelligence if not about her intentions. The diplomatic work proceeded smoothly. She departed when it was concluded. He turned his attention to other things. He thanked Rowan, not with ceremony but with honesty, one evening after a long meeting, telling him directly that he had been taking his loyalty for granted. Rowan's response to this was to look at him with mild suspicion for approximately 3 seconds, and then nod once and say that he appreciated it. Caden accepted that this was all the response he was going to get, and that it was enough. He began listening differently in council meetings, not just for the information, but for the person behind the information, for what the junior advisors were actually trying to say when they brought things to his attention, and what they needed him to understand. He found, doing this, that several of them had been trying to tell him useful things for months, and he had been moving too fast to hear them. He did not send any more invitations to Celine Voss. He was honest with himself about why. It was connected to what she had said, but it was not defeat. It was the beginning of understanding that the kind of pursuit he had been engaged in, the careful and persistent and directed kind, was its own form of not listening. She had told him clearly what she had decided and why. Continuing to push was not persuasion. It was the thing she was already protecting herself from. He could not undo whatever knowing she had arrived with. He could only choose to become a different cost. Whether that was possible, and whether she would ever have reason to see it, were things he could not control. He was learning, slowly, that this was all right. He heard through the PAC network that Felix Voss's daughter had submitted a proposal for a border zone health clinic, a permanent facility, staffed by trained healers, serving PAC members from the neutral territories, who had no formal medical access. The proposal was well written and thorough, and it had enough support from the eastern and southern border communities that it was likely to move forward. He went to look at the proposed site one afternoon. The site was a low rectangular building on the southern edge of the neutral ground, currently unused, with a good orientation for light and enough space for a small waiting area and 3 treatment rooms. He stood in the empty main room and thought about what it would take to make it functional, and wrote down a list of things he could arrange without being asked and without attaching his name to the arrangement. He arranged them. Supply lines, maintenance contracts, a connection to the regional medical supply network that the border zone had not previously had access to. He routed everything through the territory's community development fund, which was the correct way to do it, and which meant none of it came to him. 3 weeks later, on a cold October afternoon, he found himself driving past the clinic on a different pretext, and realized, as he was driving past it, that there were lights on inside. He parked. He walked to the window, and through it he could see Celine Voss standing at a workstation, explaining something to a young woman who was taking notes. Her hands were moving in the careful, deliberate way of someone demonstrating a technique, rather than simply describing one. The young woman was nodding. There was a small child seated on an examination table, watching Celine with the specific trust of someone who had decided, quickly and entirely, that this person was safe. Caden stood outside the window in the cold air, and watched. He watched her finish the demonstration. He watched her turn to the child and say something that made the child smile. He watched her work with the competence of someone who had spent their life preparing for this, not performing it, not presenting it, just doing it, because it needed doing and she was the person who could. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to his car and drove home. He sat in his study that evening and thought about what it felt like to watch someone being fully themselves. He had seen many capable people in his life. He had sat across the table from leaders and diplomats and advisors who were excellent at what they did. But excellence was not the same as this. What he had seen through that window was not excellence. It was vocation, the specific quality of someone doing the thing they were made to do, in the place they were meant to be, without any part of themselves left over that did not belong there. He thought, I have never had that. And then, I do not know if I know how to build toward it. He got up. He went to find Rowan. He told him there were some changes he wanted to make to how the council meetings were run. He wanted to create space for the junior advisors to speak before the senior ones, because he had noticed that the information they carried was often better, and was being routinely drowned out. Rowan listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said he thought it was a good idea. "What has changed?" Rowan said. Not accusatory, just curious. Caden thought about a woman in a corridor who had told him he was a cost. He thought about a window in the cold and a child's face, and the particular quality of someone who had become exactly who they intended to be. "I am trying to pay better attention," he said. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said, "that will help." He said it simply, without making more of it than it was, which was a small thing, and the right thing, and exactly the kind of thing Caden was beginning, slowly, to understand the value of. The illness came without warning, which was the nature of it, a respiratory infection that moved through the displaced families in the neutral border zone in the first week of November, fast and indiscriminate, hitting children and older adults hardest, and spreading through the shared water systems and the close quarters of temporary shelters that had always been inadequate. Celine was at the clinic on a Tuesday morning when the first cluster came in. 3 children from the same family, all under 8, with high fevers and labored breathing. A grandmother who had been sick for 4 days and was significantly worse than she should have been given the progression. A young father carrying his youngest child and barely managing to look steady. She triaged immediately, identifying the grandmother as the most urgent case and getting her onto the examination table before the family had finished explaining what had happened. She was calm in the way she was always calm in crises, not the performed calm of someone suppressing panic, but the actual calm of someone whose attention sharpened in the presence of urgency and became useful instead of scattered. She sent Ada, her clinic administrator, to contact the border zone coordinator. She sent the father to wait with the children in the side room and give them water. She began working on the grandmother. By the afternoon, she had seen 12 cases. By the end of the day, 23. By Wednesday morning, the neutral zone coordinator was using the word outbreak. Celine wrote a formal resource request to the nearest PAC authority, which was the Blackwood Coordination Office, and submitted it through official channels. She was precise and clinical in the language, because that was what the situation required, and because it was the fastest path to getting what the clinic needed. She got a response within 6 hours. The response was from Caden Blackwood himself, which was not what she had expected. She had expected a logistics coordinator, someone in the chain of command rather than at its head. The response confirmed that the Blackwood PAC was authorizing full resource support and would send a logistics team and additional medical personnel within 24 hours. It also said, near the end, that he would be joining the ground team personally to oversee coordination. She read that last part twice. She folded the letter, then she went back to her patients. He arrived the next morning with 3 vehicles and 12 people, including 2 experienced healers and a logistics coordinator who turned out to be extremely competent and with whom Celine quickly established a productive working relationship. Caden came into the clinic with the practical efficiency of a man who understood that he was there to work and not to be seen working, and he said to her, "What do you need first?" She told him. He made it happen. They worked together for 14 days. It was, in its way, unlike anything she had experienced in her previous life with him, because in her previous life, her work had been invisible to him, something he relied on without registering. Here, in the daily difficulty of the outbreak, her competence was fully visible, and he saw it, not in a performed way, not with the particular flattery of someone trying to get something, but with the simple acknowledgement of a man who was watching someone do something well and knew what he was seeing. She did not let this move her. She noted it the way she noted other facts, with precision and without attaching significance it had not earned. They had a pattern to the days. She managed the medical side, the diagnosis and treatment protocols, the prioritization of limited resources, the decisions about who needed immediate care and who could wait. He managed the logistics and the interpack communication and the supply chain that kept everything moving. Rowan ran the overnight coordination so that one of them could sleep. Ada handled the documentation and the family communication, which was its own kind of skilled work. At the end of each day, Celine and Caden went over what had happened and what the next day would require. These conversations were efficient. They were also honest in the way that conversations became when people were exhausted and there was too much at stake for anything else. On the 6th day, in the portable shelter that served as their coordination office, she was updating case records by lamplight, while he sat across the narrow table reviewing supply logs, and he said, without looking up, "Why medicine?" She looked at him. "Because it addresses the thing directly," she said. "You find the problem. You work on it. When you cannot solve it, you manage it honestly, and you are present for the person through it." He was quiet for a moment. "No politics." "There is some politics," she said, "but it is in service of the patient and not the other way around." He put down his supply log. He looked at her. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "You may." "Why did you stay away?" he said. "Not as an argument. I mean, I want to understand." She looked at him across the lamplit table, 6 days into a shared crisis, and thought about what she owed him, and what she had to give, and where the line was between honesty and oversharing. "I spent a significant portion of my life," she said slowly, "making myself useful to other people, at the expense of what I needed. Not in small ways, in fundamental ways." She paused. "I had to stop doing that completely, before I could do anything else. And stopping completely meant not placing myself where the habit could take hold again." He was listening without interrupting. She continued. "You are the kind of person who would not necessarily intend to activate that habit," she said. "But you would." She met his eyes. "You take up space the way certain people do, and that space crowds out other things. The things that got crowded out, for me, were the things I needed most. I could not afford to let that happen again." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What changed? For you, I mean. What made you build things differently?" She considered the question. "I understood what it had cost me," she said, "and I understood that knowing the cost beforehand was the only way to make a different choice." "You made a different choice," he said, "by staying away." "Yes. And now?" She looked at him. "Now we are in the middle of an outbreak, and there are 43 patients who need us to do our jobs." He held her gaze for a moment, then he picked up his supply log. "Fair," he said. They went back to work. On the 9th day, he made a mistake. He approved a supply transfer that conflicted with a protocol she had established for the northern shelter, and 3 families did not receive their allocation on schedule. She found out at 6 in the evening, and corrected it by 8, but it cost 2 hours she did not have. She told him what had happened. He did not make excuses. He did not over-explain. He said, "That was my error. I should have cross-referenced your protocols before approving the transfer. I will not do that again." And then, "What else do you need from me tonight?" She looked at him for a moment. She told him what she needed. He provided it. On the 11th day, the oldest patient, a woman in her 70s, who had been the most critically ill, turned a corner and began to improve. Celine stood outside the clinic in the cold air afterward, breathing for a moment, and she heard footsteps behind her, and knew without looking that it was him. He came to stand beside her. He did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and for a few minutes they stood together in the cold November air, looking at the border landscape, the low gray sky, the bare trees, the careful order of the temporary shelters they had organized together over 11 days. It was strange, she thought, how some things could be both true at once. That she had chosen correctly by staying away from him, and that his presence beside her, quiet and undemanding, was something she did not object to. She did not say that. She let it be a private thing. "You have built something real here," he said eventually. She looked at the clinic. The lights were on inside, and she could see Ada's shadow moving through the window. "I am building it," she said. "It is not finished." "Most real things are not," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the clinic, not at her, and his expression was the one she had started to recognize over the past 11 days. A man doing the work of being honest with himself, not all at once but steadily, without drama. "You are different from what I expected," she said. He turned to look at her. "What did you expect?" She thought about it carefully. "Someone who took more," she said. "Someone who collected things and people without accounting for the cost to them." "And now?" "Now I think you are learning to account," she said. "I do not know where that ends up, but I think it is real." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That is more than I thought you would give me." "It is what I see," she said simply. "I try to say what I see." They went back inside. There were still things to do, and they did them, and the outbreak continued its slow turn toward containment, and the days ran their course. She thought, on the 12th day, while reviewing case records, about the line she had drawn for herself, about the woman she had been, and the woman she was now, and the difference between them, which was not that the second one did not feel things, but that the second one knew the difference between feeling something and building a life around it. She was not going to build her life around this. She was not going to make herself small to fit beside him. She was not going to give what she had given before, that quiet and total and ultimately fatal gift of herself in service of someone who did not know how to carry it. But she could see him. She could let him be a person she saw clearly, neither less nor more than what he was, without it costing her anything. That was new. That was something the first life had not given her the ability to do. On the 14th day, the crisis center downgraded the outbreak to manageable, and the Blackwood logistical team began its withdrawal. Caden was the last to leave, which she had not expected, but which she understood, because it was the right thing, and he was beginning to do more right things, for the right reasons. Before he left, he came to the clinic door, and stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the work, for the honesty. Thank you for the resources," she said. "Without them, we could not have managed." A pause. He nodded once, the kind of nod that contained more than it showed. She nodded back. He walked to his car. She watched him go, and then she went inside and sat at the workstation, and began updating the remaining patient records, and she thought about 14 days, and 2 people working hard at the same thing, and the conversations by lamplight, and the way he had stood beside her in the cold, without demanding anything from her silence. She thought, maybe, perhaps, not yet, and possibly not ever, but perhaps. She filed the thought carefully, the way she filed things that were not yet ready to become decisions, and she went back to work. The clinic opened officially in the 3rd week of January, and Celine had learned enough from her previous life to know that the opening of something was not the end of the work but a particular kind of beginning, the kind where other people started relying on the thing you had built, which meant it now had a weight beyond your own investment in it. She had not wanted a ceremony. She had wanted the clinic to open the way good things opened, quietly, ready to be used, already useful before anyone made a speech about it. She conceded a small gathering at Mira's insistence. "People want to see it," Mira said, on their Tuesday call, using the specific tone she used when she knew she was right and was being diplomatic about it. "Let them see it. Let yourself be seen doing something good." Celine thought about this. "It is not about being seen," she said. "I know," Mira said. "That is exactly why you should let it happen. Because it is real, and real things deserve to be witnessed, and you have been in the habit of hiding real things." She could not argue with this. She was still working on the habit. The gathering was small. 40 people, clinic staff and community members, and a handful of PAC representatives from the neutral zone families. Her father drove up the evening before and stayed overnight. He arrived with his jar of measured tea, one of his quiet gestures, which she had started recognizing as love, expressed in his particular language, and saving up instead of missing. Mira arrived that morning with Leo, the cartographer, who was exactly as Celine had imagined him from 2 careful sentences in a letter. Precise in his thinking, warmly awkward in person, clearly very devoted to her sister, in a way that was uncomplicated and lovely to witness. They stood in the clinic together before anyone else arrived. Celine and Mira and Felix and Leo and Ada, who had become one of her most trusted colleagues, and was now running the day-to-day administration with the particular organized enthusiasm of someone who had found their exact right work. They stood in the main room that Celine had painted herself last month, with the examination tables and the supply shelves, and the clean light coming through the windows she had chosen for their orientation toward the winter sun, and Mira took her hand briefly and squeezed it and said nothing, because sometimes nothing was the right thing to say. People arrived. They moved through the clinic, asked questions, admired the setup and the patient protocols, and talked about what this would mean for the border community families who had never had reliable medical access. A woman from one of the furthest border settlements told Celine that her daughter had been treated here during the outbreak and that without this clinic she did not know what would have happened. Celine listened and said that she was glad the care had helped, and she meant both words individually and together. Her father found his way to her side during the gathering, and they stood together looking at the room full of people moving through the space she had built. "This is yours," he said. "It is the community's," she said. "I built it for them." Both things are true, he said. She could see that he was proud in the way he was proud of things, not in a showy way, but in the way that went deep, that had settled somewhere inside him, like a stone that belonged in that particular place. Thank you for being here, she said. I would not be anywhere else, he said. Nora arrived late, slightly out of breath, holding a small potted plant she had insisted on bringing, because she had read somewhere that plants in medical settings helped people feel calmer. Celine accepted the plant with complete seriousness, and they spent 3 minutes deciding where to put it, which was a perfect amount of time to spend on that particular question. After the gathering, after everyone had gone home and the clinic was quiet again, and Ada had locked up and left, Celine walked home through the cold January evening. The sky was clear, the early dark that came in the middle of winter making the stars visible before 5 o'clock. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and thought about the day, and about what it felt like to have built something that was going to keep going, whether or not she was in the room. That was the thing about real structures. They held without you. You could step back and they remained. She had not always known how to build things that held without her. She was learning. At home she made tea and sat at her desk by the window that looked out on the courtyard with its bare winter tree. She had started keeping a journal 3 years ago. Not because she had always been a journal-keeping person, but because Nora had told her once that writing things down made them more real, and she had wanted the things she was building to be real. She opened it now. She wrote about the opening. She wrote about Mira's hand in hers, and her father's jar of measured tea, and Leo's careful warmth, and Ada's organized enthusiasm. She wrote about the woman whose daughter had survived the outbreak. She wrote about standing in the room she had made and feeling, without qualification, that it was hers, and that she had built it for the right reasons, and that the right reasons were what made it hold. She wrote, I am building a life that is mine. Every part of it. Not in opposition to anyone, not to prove a point, not as a recovered self after a destruction. Just mine. Because I know now that this is what I was supposed to be doing. And I know because I know what it feels like to spend years doing everything else instead. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. Then she added, 3 years is a short time to become a different version of yourself, but it is long enough if you spend it deliberately. She closed the journal. She thought about Caden, who had since sent 2 letters that were practical in form and something else in their undercurrent. Letters about the border clinic's formal recognition by the Blackwood Pack, which was genuinely useful, and which she had responded to with professionalism and a small warmth that was genuine. She had not seen him in 3 months. She was not in a hurry. She was not building toward him. She was not building away from him. She was simply building, and where she arrived when she arrived was not something she could see from here, and she found that she did not need to see it. That was the thing she had learned, the thing that the long way around had given her, the ability to be in the present, where she was, without needing to know the shape of what was coming. She had tried to know the shape of things in her first life. She had told herself that love given completely would be returned, that sacrifice would be recognized, that staying would be enough. Those had all been bets on a future she could not see. This time she was not betting on futures. She was investing in present things, the clinic, the patients, Mira on Tuesday evenings, Felix with his jar of measured tea, Nora calling with a question about the assessment rubric, Ada locking up with the thoroughness of someone who had found her exact right work. These were her things. She had built them carefully. She intended to keep them. She got up and rinsed her teacup and turned off the desk lamp. She stood for a moment at the window in the dark room, looking at the courtyard tree against the sky, the branches precise and intricate in the winter light coming from the street. She thought, I came back with nothing but memory. And then, I am leaving this life, whenever it ends, however it ends, with everything. Not the title she had never officially held, not the position she had worn herself out trying to justify, not the recognition that had never come, everything else, the clinic that would be here in the morning, the sister who called twice a week, the father who had the tea ready, the friend who brought a plant to a medical opening and spent 3 minutes deciding where to put it, the patients who trusted her, the ones she had healed and the ones she had not been able to heal, and the ones she was still learning how to help. The knowledge of her own size, finally, after everything, after the long and painful education of the first life, and the careful construction of the second. She knew her own size now. She did not make herself smaller. She did not make herself larger. She simply took up the space that was hers and let it be enough. Because it was enough. Because she was enough. Because she had learned this the hardest possible way, and she was not going to waste the learning. She went to bed. Outside the window, the courtyard tree held its shape in the dark, bare-branched and patient, and exactly where it was supposed to be. Across town, the clinic held its shape too. Lights off, doors locked, ready for morning. And Celine Voss slept without interruption. The deep and untroubled sleep of a woman who had given herself the only thing that had ever actually been hers. Her own life, chosen, deliberately and fully, in both hands.